Okay, in this session, let's talk about behavioral pricing. So up to this point, we've been talking about pricing from an economic sense. So we talked about value-based pricing, which was pricing based on economic value. Now let's sort of switch gears and talk about pricing from a more of a psychological perspective, more from a behavioral perspective. This slide goes to show you what we've been discussing up to this point. So let's just basically summarize this slide, and then we'll move on to pricing from a behavioral perspective. So this slide shows you where going from top to bottom, we have objective value. Again, we talked about objective value. That's like true economic value. That's the value that a supplier or a firm or a company perceives its products to deliver. Whereas perceived value is from the customer's perspective. So that's the value that a customer perceives the product to deliver. And then we have the actual price below that, and then we have the COGS, the cost of goods sold. So the difference between perceived value and actual price is customers' incentive to purchase. All right, so the bigger the difference between perceived value and actual price, the greater the incentive for customers to buy. And then there has to be an incentive for firms to sell as well. So the difference between actual price and COGS would be the firm's incentive to sell. Again, the greater that difference, the more incentive there is for firms to sell. So this perceived value is, again, it's the value that a customer perceives a product to have. And that would be actually the maximum price that a customer is willing to pay. So, because customers are only willing to pay to the point where they perceive value from the product. So, to the left there, we have marketing efforts and the price of substitutes. So basically, one of the roles, this slide kind of shows you the contribution and the role of marketing, where the role of marketing is through marketing efforts to increase perceived value. So if companies can move that perceived value upwards, closer to objective value through marketing efforts, then they're going to be able to charge a higher price. Because if perceived value goes up, then customers will be able to, they'll be more willing to pay a higher price, which implies that the company will actually be able to charge a higher price. So the actual price will also be elevated when perceived value goes up. But at the same time, when there's the price of substitutes, so when there's a substitute, a competitor provides a substitute in the market, that will drive the perceived value of my product down. So there's external forces that will either increase the perceived value or decrease the perceived value. So this slide just goes to show you how different values work along with the actual price that a customer ends up paying, which determines the customer's incentive to purchase and the firm's incentive to sell. So going back to our previous slide where we showed perceived value and the actual price, this goes back to basic economic 101. So customers buy when perceived value is greater than the actual price. So when price is below perceived value, this provides a motivation for customers to buy. So this underlines an economic incentive for customers to buy. However, as we will show you, customers are not just influenced by economic incentives or economic utility. They are also heavily influenced and impacted by psychological utility. So my purpose in this session is to show you a lot of examples, a lot of scenarios. So we'll be comparing and contrasting different scenarios to show you how behavioral or psychological factors come into play and how that affects customers' perception of fairness in pricing, which ultimately affects customers' willingness to pay. Because pricing at the end of the day, from a customer's perspective, has a lot to do with perceived fairness. So customers will say, is this price really fair given, the circumstances? So not only does economic utility affect customers' willingness to pay for a product or a service, but on top of that, it's also psychological utility that, in addition to economic utility, that collectively influences fairness, which in turn influences customers' willingness to pay. So again, like I said, I'm going to show you, multiple different scenarios to underscore and emphasize how psychological factors determine and affect customers' willingness to pay. So let's take a look at this scenario 1A. So I'm going to read out this scenario, each of the scenarios in this session, and then I'm going to compare and contrast the two sessions, two paired scenarios to get my point across. So the following scenario reads as follows. So you are lying on the beach on a hot day. All you have to drink is ice water. For the past hour, you have been thinking about how much you would enjoy a nice cold bottle of your favorite beer. A friend gets up to make a phone call and offers to bring back a bottle of your favorite beer from the only nearby place where beer is sold, a small run-down grocery store. He says that the beer might be expensive and asks how much you are willing to spend. He says he will not buy the beer if it costs more than the price you state. What price do you tell your friend? Okay, so you tell a price, this is the price that I'm willing to pay for this beer when it's, you're going to buy it from a small rundown grocery store. So this is scenario 1A. Scenario 1B reads as the following. Everything is the same, so I won't go through everything because all the information in scenario 1B is identical to scenario 1A, except for the following. The only difference is a friend gets up to make a phone call and offers to bring back a bottle of your favorite beer from the only nearby place where beer is sold. And this time, it is not from a rundown grocery store. It is from a fancy resort hotel. So then the scenario also ends by asking you, what price do you tell your friend? So if you compare scenario 1A to scenario 1B, it's the same beer. You're lying on a beach. The beer is not going to taste different depending on whether the beer is bought from a fancy resort hotel or from a rundown grocery store. It's the same beer. So the economic utility, the perceived value minus the actual price is going to be the same. But people will perceive, but when this study was done, people said that they were willing to pay a different price depending on where the beer was bought from. This goes to show you that, people have different expectations in terms of how much they're willing to pay depending on where a product, despite the product being the same, tastes the same, provides the same utility, comes from. So obviously, people were more willing to pay more for the same beer that was bought from a fancy resort hotel compared to the beer that was purchased from a rundown grocery store.